I thought for too long, the person on the street and scientists as well have been overly focused on the dark side of human nature, on our propensity for violence and evil and mendacity and selfishness. And I thought that the bright side had been denied the attention it deserves, because equally we are capable of these amazing things like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. I mean, we're really quite an amazing species, actually. And I thought that as well, I thought that the benefits of living socially, the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. That is to say, I think across the arc of evolution, the good must have outweighed the bad. Because if every time I came near you, you stole from me, or you lied to me, or you injured me, or you killed me, I would be better off living atomistically, apart from you. So we evolved to be social. We evolved to be social in particular ways. And I think natural selection equipped us, endowed us with particular good qualities, which are required for us to live socially and which are also rightly seen as good.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 104. And this episode is with Nicholas Christakis, who is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where he is also the director of the Human Nature Lab and co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. Nicholas is both a sociologist and a physician, so after completing his undergraduate at Yale in biology, he also received an M.D. and an M.P.H. from Harvard, and then a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to all of this, Nicholas has written numerous books, but in this episode we talk about one in particular, his second to last book, and that's Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And we start off with some more theoretical ideas that underlie the investigation. And the first is the notion, which you might be familiar with if you've read much Richard Dawkins, of the extended phenotype, which refers to the way in which genes, our genes, other animals' genes, any genes, interact with and affect the environment. And then we move on to the way in which genes manifest themselves, not only in what I'll refer to now as more static traits, like hair color or height, but in behaviors or cognitive faculties, like the capacity for love, for instance, or a bias for preferring to associate with people in your quote-unquote in-group. And then from here, we move on to the main thrust of Nicholas's work, which is the idea that there are a number of cultural universals that have a genetic evolutionary origin, and that their function, their proper function, contributes to good, healthy, and flourishing societies. So in the description, I've got links to Nicholas's website. It's at humannaturelab.net, and his Twitter, N.A. Christakis, and also, naturally, to the book Blueprint. So I have to mention, as always, that likes, subscribes, these things are so helpful. And there is now also a Discord, which you can find through my website, robinsonearhart.com, if you want to make comments or suggest guests or this sort of thing, or if you want to go to robinsonsfashionempire.com and buy one of these cool new shirts that I made. I actually told somebody came up to me yesterday at the gym. I was wearing a different version and said, "That's a really cool shirt." And I was like, "Oh, I made it." And he looked at the stitching and was like, "That's really impressive." And I said, No, I didn't make it in that kind of way. But now, without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Nicholas. There are plenty of threads to Blueprint, but a central premise of the book is that while there are myriad differences in traits among individuals and societies across all sorts of dimensions, every human being nonetheless possesses an evolutionarily ingrained disposition to make and contribute to a good society. Before we get into the specifics of the book and what that statement I just made entails, I'm wondering what made you want to write about this and what brought the idea to your attention in the first place?
Well, the sort of overarching philosophical motivation for writing it, or maybe I would more properly, probably ideological motivation for writing it, was that I thought for too long the person on the street and scientists as well have been overly focused on the dark side of human nature, on our propensity for violence and evil and mendacity and selfishness. And I thought that the bright side had been denied the attention it deserves, because equally we are capable of these amazing things like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. I mean, we're really quite an amazing species, actually. And I thought that as well, I thought that the benefits of living socially, the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. That is to say, I think across the arc of evolution, the good must have outweighed the bad. Because if every time I came near you, you stole from me, or you lied to me, or you injured me, or you killed me, I would be better off living atomistically, apart from you. So we evolved to be social. We evolved to be social in particular ways, and I think natural selection equipped us, endowed us with particular good qualities which are required for us to live socially, and which are also rightly seen as good. So that, I think, was the overarching ideological motivation. The empirical motivation was that in my laboratory, I had been have been for 20 years now, studying social networks and human social interactions, and the myriad determinants of and consequences of human social interaction. And social interaction and the networks that they give rise to, these ornate, magnificent, beautiful, mathematical structures that exist in nature outside ourselves, right? We humans are obliged to make these networks, just like ants are obliged to make ant colonies and bees are obliged to make beehives. We make these ornate networks, which are astonishingly beautiful and interesting and, frankly, astonishingly consistent around the world. And these networks serve a purpose. And as I been looking at them over the last 20 years, and as I've been studying their evolutionary origins and various, as I said, determinants and consequences of networks, it became very clear that networks are interconnected with our capacity for social learning and teaching, the fact that we transmit information, which ultimately is the root of our capacity for culture, which is ultimately at the root of our capacity for wealth and survival, frankly, and also is related to our capacity for cooperation. The particular structure of these networks and their existence is deeply related to how we work together. So those empirical questions that my lab was engaging, I think, prompted deeper thinking about what's going on. And so those were the origins of the book. Let's say there was an ideological project or a philosophical project and an empirical project that animated the book, which, by the way, took about 10 years to do, because it's not the only thing I am doing.
Yeah, well, it shows in the quality and depth of the research that goes into the book. But I have a couple of responses to the things you've said so far. First, though, you mentioned that we've for so long been focused on the dark side of humanity. I just had Steven Pinker on the podcast, and it sounds like you two have a serious affinity in this sense, that we've neglected the positives of humanity and its progress.
Yeah, I count Steven as a personal friend, and I, of course, am very engaged by his thinking and writing, and have been for a long time. And actually, if I may hazard a kind of symmetry and contrast between some of the ideas he's been discussing and some of the ideas that Blueprint engages, it would be the following. What Stephen and others have been arguing is that since the Enlightenment, there have been a number of philosophical moves and technological advances that have improved the predicament of humankind. So we have a kind of philosophical efflorescence during the Enlightenment with ideas about the equality of human beings, about democracy, and that these principles, originating in Northern Europe, spreading around the world, unevenly applied, imperfectly realized. I recognize, of course, we still had colonialism, we still had slavery, we took a while for women's rights to catch up, and so on. Although J.S. Mills writes this magnificent book, The Subjection of Women, which is, far-sighted, like a feminist book, 100 years. Actually, there were others talking about that too. But anyway, so we have these philosophical ideas, this efflorescence, and of course we have these scientific advances, electricity, magnetism, the steam engine, and so on. And that in combination, these have propelled a kind of improvement in the predicament of humankind, Stephen argues, and others argue, such that it is absolutely the case the world is better now. We are richer, we are freer, we are healthier, we live longer, we are more peaceful, and that these benefits, this reality of the predicament of humankind, is rightly laid at the feet of this inflection that took place. I think all of that's true as an empirical matter. But what I'm arguing is that deeper, more powerful, more ancient forces are propelling a good society that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, if you look at the evolution of our species over, our particular species, that certainly goes back 200,000, and increasingly we're thinking 300,000 years, that we evolved all of these fantastic qualities that endow us and equip us to live well together. And as I kind of conclude in the book, the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness. And so I see these efforts as parallel efforts. One, in Blueprint, is arguing that there are these ancient predilections that have been shaped by natural selection that undergird human behavior and that have been there and evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, of course, we have the more recent historical and cultural overlay, which, also is crucially important, but is distinct.
Mm-hmm. Well, the second thing I wanted to comment on centers just on our evolutionary origin and this idea you expressed a few minutes ago that just like ants are obliged to make their colonies, we're obliged to make our social networks. And this leads to one bit of context I'd like to settle before we continue. So I'm sure everyone listening is familiar with the idea that our genes play a major role in determining our phenotype, so our observable characteristics, the other large player being our environment, but they may be less familiar with the extended phenotype, which I think you mentioned that in the book that it's a term introduced by Richard Dawkins, but which roughly refers to the idea that our genes also determine the way we interact with and alter our environment. So I'm wondering if you could flesh this idea out a bit more. So there are some great examples in your book. Spider webs come to mind, but it's important for the understanding of how genes carried by an individual affect societies.
So, so the intellectual history here is very interesting to me. I don't know if it'll be interesting to you or your listeners.
I think it will be.
Around 2000 and 2005, 2007, somewhere in there. Actually, it was before the 2008 presidential election. A colleague of mine, James Fowler, and I had been doing a lot of work on social networks, and we had just done a study, a twin study, looking at a sort of a behavior genetic study, looking at the idea that our genes might cause us to shape our social networks. And in its most limited sense, that's a very simple claim. Like, for example, every listener is probably familiar with the idea that some children are born shy and some children are born gregarious. People vary in their taste for friendship, for example. This is not a radical claim, nor particularly innovative. But we had done some work in behavior genetics showing, for example, that if you had Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Tom was friends with Dick depended not just on Tom's genes or on Dick's genes, but on Harry's genes. Whether you and your neighbor are friends with each other depends on my genes. How can this be? Well, we had some evidence to suggest that your friendship, you and your friend, might depend on my proclivity to introduce you to each other. That people, for example, might knit the social network around them together, brokering introductions, for example, among other people. Therefore, my genes play a role in the structure of the social network outside my body, just like, for example, a bird might have a propensity to knit twigs together to make a nest with particular characteristics. So we were doing this kind of research, and it's a body of work that I continue to do to the present day, looking at with other collaborators, and looking at the kind of evolutionary biology and physiology of friendship. What are the genetic antecedents and physiologic antecedents to, and physiologic consequences of, and over the long arc of our evolution, the genetic consequences of friendship. So we'd done this paper, and I was actually at the University of Virginia giving a talk just before the presidential election, and all of a sudden I was just struck by how much bigger this idea was than I had realized. That our bodies, the impact of our genes, didn't just shape the structure and function of our bodies, didn't just shape the structure and function of our minds, but also could shape the structure and function of our social worlds. Of course, E.O. Wilson had done a ton of work on related topics, but there was a very specific meaning to this topic, that our genes could shape something outside our body. And at the time, I had done some reading about how some classic papers in psychiatry, in behavior genetics, whereby psychiatrists had become interested in what they call endophenotypes. So, for example, a propensity to anxiety that might be inside your body and is not manifest. So I thought, well, really what we're thinking about here is what I would call exophenotypes. And I was really captivated with this idea. I thought this was just a fantastic idea. Like how did I stumble on this incredible, idea? And then very soon thereafter, I read a book by Richard Dawkins called The Extended Phenotype, wherein he had basically had this idea like 20 years earlier, which was really dispiriting. It's like, it was such a good idea. And of course, he had it, much earlier. This happens all the time, by the way, in the history of ideas and in science. And it was both a reassuring but hard lesson for me. But anyway, there were certain ways in which, in our hands, the notion of an exophenotype was slightly different than what Richard had been arguing. And also, in our case, Richard, this magnificent book, The Extended Phenotype, is a theoretical exercise, and there was no empirical evidence in the book. Whereas we had, and other labs around the world, by the way, had begun to accrue evidence of the fundamentally genetic nature of the extended phenotype. So that's the origin of sort of a chance, a twin study of sociology, chance reading of papers about endophenotypes, a kind of metaphoric leap because of my familiarity with the Greek language. Well, if they're endophenotypes, maybe they're exophenotypes. And then kind of, expansion in my mind about like what could be going on there. Then the discovery, of course, of Dawkins' incredibly important, much earlier work, and so on. But we then spent a lot of time actually hunting down this idea and finding examples, and many other labs are doing the same thing. And the classic examples are ones you mentioned. For example, the spider. If natural selection shaped the mouth parts in the front of the spider to get bigger, to catch more animals, we would very trivially accept that as the workings of genetics and natural selection. But the spider on the other end of its body with its spinnerets can create what is basically a big mouth with the net that it makes, but it creates it outside its body and leaves it behind. And of course, birds make nests, and beavers make dams. A beaver has to make a dam, just as like a beaver has a big flat tail that it slaps. It has to make dams, and it makes dams of a characteristic type, a characteristic height, with characteristic materials in a characteristic manner. And beavers will do this innately. There's another whole topic about bird song, for example, and whether some bird songs are innate, some are learned, and so on. But the beavers make the dams innately. But the amazing thing is, and then I'll shut up, the amazing thing is that the beaver makes a dam, it modifies the environment, okay? And when it makes a dam, it changes the shoreline. So instead of having like a little creek, now you have a pond with a large perimeter. And this modification of the environment that the beaver makes acts as a selection pressure on other animals, right? Different kinds of fish and plants can now thrive in this different watery environment than they could before. As much as if the beaver were predating these other animals, right? Like if we understand that predators change, our selection pressure on prey. So here the beaver now is modifying the environment, and it's almost acting like a predatory force on the plants and animals around it. And that's pretty simple to understand, although it's a little step from the beaver actually predating these animals. But see, here's the thing. The beaver not only modifies the evolutionary trajectory of other species, it modifies the evolutionary trajectory of its own. The beaver creates a dam outside its body, which is now a feature of the environment. And that creates a selection pressure on the beaver. So beavers, let's say, with bigger lungs that can forage a bigger perimeter, thrive more than beavers with smaller lungs, now that a dam has been built. And then beavers with bigger lungs can, in the next generation, want to make, let's say, bigger dams. So you get this feedback loop where the animal is programmed to make something outside its body. That feature now circles back and modifies the evolutionary trajectory of the animal, and you can have a kind of breakneck movement down this evolutionary path. And the argument that I make in Blueprint is, in essence, that we humans knit the people around us or modify the social networks around us, and therefore particular kinds of humans can thrive. Friendly people make friendly networks, and friendly networks are especially conducive to friendly people. Now, there are wrinkles and complications to the story, but that's the gist of it.
Well, two things. First, please don't worry at all about going on too long, because I am much more interested in hearing you speak than me. And then second, taking this more toward humans now. At the outset of Blueprint, you identify a number of innate proclivities that would obviously bias our social interactions in certain ways. And a few that you mention in a cluster are in-group favoritism, trade-complementarity, social hierarchy, collective cooperation, network topology, social learning, and evolved morality. But before we talk...
I don't think I include trade complementarity and evolved morality in the social suite. So I'm not sure which list.
It's not in the social suite. I'm not talking about that yet. But
okay.
Yeah, before we talk about
the story about the story about when I was a boy playing with those Turkish kids, you mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But before we get into these items that I just mentioned, I'm just curious about the state of the investigation into the genetic basis of these traits in humans, because I recall from reading some of Trudy Mackey's work on the genetic basis of, I think it was mating dances and Drosophila, that these traits are so often polyvalent and highly complex. I mean, in that the genes that determine them are polyvalent, that it's difficult to pin down the actual genetic basis of the traits, or the behaviors, even if you know that they're genetically determined. And this just makes me assume that since human behavior is, levels of magnitude, even though that's, a rough way of putting it, more complicated than the flies, the actual genetic basis of the behaviors that you're describing in the book, it must be very far from untangled.
Correct. And like any kind of, they're very, the most people, when they think about how different variants of genes play a role in different phenotypes, remember the classic examples of thalassemia and sickle cell disease from high school biology, or the smooth and the rough peas, that Mendel looked at, which were, as you said, monogenetic traits. But in most animals, a given gene affects many traits. That's called pleiotropy. And when it comes to behaviors, there also, not only does any given gene affect many different phenotypes. So, for example, I'm making this up, a gene that affects hair color might also affect, anxiety. That's a completely made up example, but, the same gene might play a role in both of those phenotypes. But also any given phenotype has many genes that help explain it. So as you suggested, it's a complicated mess. And in humans, we have very limited understanding. Now, we have some, for example, we have certain genes that are associated with schizophrenia. We have certain genes that are known to be associated with educational attainment, but explain only a tiny fraction of the variance. So most of educational attainment has nothing to do with our genes, but some of it has a little bit to do with our genes, and specific genes have been isolated that, or for which variants of those genes help explain such outcomes like schizophrenia and so on. However, having said that, there are animal models that are increasingly well worked out that are amazing. So one of the well worked out examples is some work with a certain kind of mouse species, oldfield mice, that Hopi Hoekstra at Harvard has worked out. So these mice make a burrow under the ground and make a particular kind of burrow with an entrance and then a little a sort of cavern that they live in. And the kind of burrow they make is innate. So, like if you put the mouse in a cage and give it sand and wood chips and other natural materials, it'll just make this kind of burrow. Now, there's a different closely related species that makes a slightly different burrow that, in addition to certain other modifications to the feet, to the neck entrance and the cavern part, has an escape hatch, builds a little escape hatch. And through some ingenious experiments where she and her students crossbred these mice and then isolated the genes that were responsible, was able to show that whether or not the mouse constructed a burrow with an escape hatch, this physical feature in the environment outside the mouse's body, depended, I think, on 2 or 3 specific genes. So if you had particular variants of these genes, then the mouse made a burrow with an escape hatch, otherwise it did not. So here's an example of an exophenotype under the control of a very limited set of particular genes. It's a complex behavior. It's shown in mice. And there are many other examples, not many. There are a handful of other such well-worked out examples that I discuss in the book. And this, in combination with other evidence in humans, suggests that something similar is happening in humans. With other, we don't build burrows. We do other things. That's what's going on.
So again, I'm not at the social suite just yet, but I did want to ask about a couple of the technical terms I mentioned a few minutes earlier, and because I think, one, they're interesting, but also important maybe going forward. So the first is technical, though I already just said that, but what is network topology?
Well, so network topology is just the mathematical structure of a network. So, for example, in your mind's eye, imagine 100 buttons that are strewn on the floor, and I give you 500 strings, and the buttons have holes in them, and I tell you to pick 2 buttons, let's say at random, and connect them with one of the strings, and you do that, and then I say, now pick 2 buttons at random again and connect them with a string, and you do that till you exhaust all of the strings. And if you look down on the floor where you've done this exercise, you'll have a gamish of buttons and strings connecting buttons together, and it'll have a particular visual appearance. Now, you should have the intuition that in this exercise that I just imagined, in this Gedanken experiment, in this thought experiment, you will have some of the buttons might never have been picked, so they'll have no strings attached to them. And other buttons might have been picked a lot, and they'll have many strings attached to them, and so on. And if you look down at this image, now you can imagine you'll bend, if this gamish of buttons, you can imagine you pick up a button and you lift it into the air. And if you do that, the button you picked will come up, and then there'll be a layer of buttons that are one thread removed, and then below that, a layer of buttons that are two threads removed, and so on. And you pick this up, and then you move over here, and you drop it on the floor again. Now, if you take a photograph of it, the photograph will be different. It'll look different than when you picked it up. But you should have the intuition that there's something deep that hasn't changed about it. That's the topology, right? The structure, the pattern of interactions among the buttons specified by the threads is invariant to its rendition in two-dimensional space. There's this hyperdimensional structure defined by the nodes, the buttons, and the threads, the ties, the edges, they're sometimes called. But it's invariant. So that's the topology of the network. That's the structure of the network. And now the structure can also vary. You should have the intuition that if you repeated the exercise with 100 buttons and the 500 threads, you would get a different structure, right? It's not the same the next time you do it. And furthermore, you might have the intuition that there are specific classes of structures of topologies. So you might imagine that in the extremes, you might have, let's say, 30 students in a classroom. None of them might be friends with anyone else. That would be an empty set. There are no connections among the 30 students. Or in the other extreme, every student is connected to every other student. That would be a fully saturated graph, a full set. So those are the two extremes. No connections, every connection. And the number of every connections is n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So 30 times 29 divided by 2 is the maximum number of connections. And you should have the intuition that any possible combination in between those is possible. And there are classes of those possibilities that can be understood, and those classes, those particular topological classes, have relevance to human experience. Let me give you one example. There's a property of human social networks called assortativity, degree assortativity. And that's the reality we're all familiar with, that popular people befriend popular people and unpopular people befriend unpopular people. The degree of a node is the number of connections this has. So degree assortativity means they assort with each other. The popular people form friendships with popular people and the unpopular people with unpopular people. That's called degree assortativity. We all know that's a real feature of social life. But if you stop and think about it, the airport network is the opposite of that. Airports are degree disassortative. You don't have Chicago and Denver and New York all connected to each other, and then small airports in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and New Haven, Connecticut, and Greensboro, North Carolina, or something connected to each other. No, we have a hub and spoke system. So the unpopular airports are connected to the popular airports, and the popular airports are connected to the unpopular airports. Now, they're also connected to each other. Of course, you can fly from Denver to LA, but the unpopular airports, of course, you are connected to the popular ones, not to each other. So the airport network is degree disassortative. And humans make degree assortative networks. So of all the possible kinds of networks, like I was discussing earlier, between the null set and the full set, we make a subset of them that obey this other guiding principle called degree assortativity. Did I answer your question?
You did. Absolutely. Yeah. And presumably then, if in studying multiple societies, you found their social networks converging on similar topologies,
yes,
modulo, of course, that there can be different types of networks within a given society. One hypothesis, maybe the preferred one, might be that we have an inherent disposition to form such structures. in an analogous way, say, if you found an isolated group of humans with brown hair, you would assume that this was an inherent and hereditarily transmitted trait.
Yes, the argument is that there is, of course, tremendous cultural variation in many features of human life, including in friendship. There is some variation. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't find many male-female friendships, right? It's a very sex-segregated society, whereas in our society, it's not uncommon to have genuine friendships between men and women. So there's a cultural shaping of the networks. But what we show, and we've mapped, my lab has mapped networks around the world. We've mapped networks amongst the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, amongst the Nyangatom in Sudan, in Honduras, in India, in the United States. We've done many, many exercises where we have gone and mapped, discerned the structure of these networks. And all of them obey certain deep and particular mathematical principles. So the argument is that the kinds of networks we make are like beehives. You know, we have certain underlying principles that are shaped by natural selection and genetically encoded that oblige us to have particular kinds of networks. And one sort of thought experiment or one toy way of thinking about this is to ask yourself the following question. If you could have interviewed my grandmother, who's now dead, who was born in the 19th century.
I missed my opportunity.
Yes, if you could have interviewed her about what life was like for her in this little Greek village in southern Greece when she was an 11-year-old girl, she would have said, I had one or two best friends, and there were 4 or 5 of us girls. We hung out together. We were close friends. And if you could have asked my daughter, Eleni, the same question almost 100 years later, when she was 11 and she had an iPhone in her pocket, she would give you the same answer. I had 1 or 2 best friends. There were 4 or 5 of us girls. We hung out together. So there's something very deep and fundamental that is invariant to the technology. Not like the iPhone, suddenly transformed us into a different kind of animal. We didn't suddenly develop the capacity to have 100 intimate friends simply because we had an electronic device that could, have their phone numbers on file and their photographs on file. We have a very innate proclivities to friendship, and they don't vary very much by historical epoch or, as it turns out, cultural surroundings. So, friendship is found in virtually every society. The features of friendship are very consistent. People feel good in the company of their friends. They will pay a price to benefit their friends. They act altruistically towards their friends. Gift giving is a common feature of friendship. Intimate conversations are a common feature of friendship. These are cultural universals, and friendship is. So that's, and now it is the case that institutions can shape it. Which friends you have will depend on, what kind of social environment you grew up in. How big your high school is. What kind of dormitory arrangements exist in your college. Whether you go to church or not. All of these are, of course, important to the human experience of friendship, but there's something deep and underlying that is not so sensitive to those types of cultural and historical specificities.
Mm-hmm. And maybe touching on one of those, but with regard to our proclivity toward friendship that you were just discussing, the other quality I wanted to ask about before we move on, that you mentioned in this anecdote about the Turkish children in the book, is trade-complementarity, and how, maybe just as an example of how something that factors into our proclivity toward friendship.
Yeah, so the story in the book was that when I was a little boy, my mother was a Byzantine Greek. She had grown up in Istanbul, ethnically Greek, growing up in Istanbul. And my mother, there's a long and interesting family history there with intersects with the history of the 20th century. In the 1950s, there were sort of anti-Greek pogroms in Turkey. My mother's family basically fled the country. But many years later, as an American citizen, and my mother took us back. I was a little boy. I went back to Greece. My mother spoke Turkish, and I learned a little bit of Turkish when I was a boy. And we spent a summer in the kind of ancestral place where my mother had spent the summers when she was a little girl on this little island on the Bosphorus in Turkey called Biyukada. That's how the Turks call it. The Greeks called it Prinkipolis. And we arrived there and we went out to play. I mean, I don't know how old I was. I must have been 8 or something, and my brother was 6 or something. And we went out to play, and we found some Turkish boys to play with. And it was very easy. The games were the same. And we sorted ourselves into groups and engaged in some kind of play warfare where we were throwing pine cones at each other, and accumulating stocks of pine cones and lobbing them at the enemy, and maneuvering for advantage. And it was joyful and fantastic play. This is more than 50 years later, and I remember it fondly. I remember the experience of playing in these pine forests behind the house. And the reason I tell the story in the book is that there is a long tradition in anthropology and in psychology to study, a huge and fascinating literature to study the origins and functions of play and the way in which certain kinds of play don't vary from place to place and culture to culture. And one of the arguments about play is that it prepares us to live socially, and that if you think about a lot of children's play, it's about getting along with others. It's about creating little social situations and so on. And so here we were across cultures. We had different haircuts and different attire and spoke different languages, me and my brother and these Turkish boys. And yet we had a wonderful time. And the rules of play and the social rules of play were very obvious to all of us. And we were able to engage in this activity quite happily and quite productively. And this activity was characterized by a number of features, one of which, as you mentioned, was this trade-complementarity. We very naturally developed a little economy where we were trading, small pine cones that were like this big with big ones where the petals had all erupted open. And, we were doing all kinds of things that were features of society and of economies.
Well, I think now is a good time to move into the social suite, the meat of the book, and perhaps some more controversial material. And so one thing, maybe what we
I'm relieved to hear that nothing I've said so far is controversial. That's good. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's not controversial for me. It all makes sense and resonates. But what I had in mind now, I'm taking it on your word that this is controversial, which is cultural universals, because you mentioned in your book that they've been a topic of very hot debate in the anthropological literature.
Yes, this is also an old and interesting topic, which is, are there qualities of human social life that are invariant? For example, the gender division of labor is found in basically every society. Now, what men do and what women do will vary from place to place, but the fact that there are so-called male jobs and so-called female jobs, I think, is found in every society. So there's a big debate about this, about whether there are cultural universals, what those cultural universals are, and if we were to find them, what would it mean? Would it mean, for example, that those have arisen because of some kind of, let's say, evolutionarily shaped process? Are they like genetic, quote unquote? Or perhaps they simply relate to fundamental physiologic needs. For example, every society is concerned with the acquisition of food. Well, the necessity of eating is a biological, function of human beings, and we evolved to like salty and sweet and fatty things. And so societies around the world will concern themselves with the acquisition of food and privilege salty and sweet and fatty things. So we shouldn't be surprised if we find that sweet things are universally liked. That relates to our physiology. It's not it would be, let's say, universal. So, but there's a contention as to how, as I said, which things are universal, how many things are universal, and what explains their universality. And the claim that I'm trying to advance is that certain specific things, for example, love is a universal, and I'm trying to advance the argument that love has been shaped by our biology, by our evolutionary past. Like other animals, we reproduce sexually, we mate with each other. Of course, there are some creatures that reproduce asexually, but most creatures, depends on how you count species, but a vast number of species reproduce sexually. We do too, but we don't just mate with each other. We love each other. We form a sentimental attachment with the individuals with whom we are having sex. You don't need love to have sex, to be clear. You don't need sex to have love, but generally speaking, we have a sentimental attachment to our conspecifics that we are having sex with. And this capacity is an evolved capacity. It has I think, a very interesting, likely evolutionary origin and function. And one of its functions is to enhance the survival of our offspring. But I think it's kind of magnificent to think about that this extraordinary human ability for love, which is seen in homosexual couples, it's seen in straight couples, it's seen in polygynous societies, it's seen in polyandrous societies, it's seen in societies with arranged marriage. It's seen everywhere. Love is seen. Is a pretty remarkable, to me at least, quality that we have, and it's one of the things that I put in the social suite. To be clear, what I argue about the social suite is that it's a set of properties that are biologically encoded, shaped by natural selection, required for social living, and expressed interindividually. In other words, we don't care whether you love yourself or are kind to yourself or are just to yourself. We care whether you love others or are kind to others or are just to others. So these are qualities you see that require someone else to express. You can't befriend yourself. You befriend someone else. So all of these elements of the social suite have to do with the interaction with others who must necessarily be present for these qualities to be manifested. And that makes it different, for example, than other kinds of behaviors like bravery. You can be brave against another person who's threatening you, or with another person when you go to, let's say, I'm going to work with you to go, kill a lion or something. But you can also be brave on your own, right? Try to kill the lion on your own, or try to leap across a cliff on your own, right? That calls for bravery that you can manifest by yourself. But love is different, or friendship is different, or cooperation. You can't cooperate with yourself. You have to cooperate with someone else. The presence of an alter to your ego is required for the manifestation of these qualities. And those are for example, another one I have is mild hierarchy. You can't have inequality in yourself. To have inequality, there must be someone else. There has to be a group for there to be inequality and mild hierarchy. So all of these features in the social suite have these properties that I alluded to.
Mm-hmm. So just in the interest of getting it all out on the table, I'll enumerate these 8 aspects of the social suite. So you already mentioned love for partners and offspring, and then mild hierarchy. But the other 6 are the capacity to have and recognize individual identity, friendship, social networks, cooperation, preference for one's own group, and then social learning and teaching. But hopefully, to paraphrase somewhat accurately what you just said a few minutes ago, and then to get clarification if this isn't quite accurate, is the idea roughly that not only were these 8 qualities ingrained in us and by extension our societies through natural selection, and that they have to be expressed among individuals collectively, but also, and here's where I might be adding something, they are in a sense optimal for our flourishing in a competitive world?
Yes, in order to have a functional society, we need to express those things. I need to be clear about something else, which is that you can have stunted societies, just like you can have stunted bodies. your genes shape the kind of kidney and liver and pancreas you have, the kind of brain you have. But if I starve you when you're a child, you don't grow as tall, you might be more prone to diabetes, your brain doesn't make all those wonderful connections that it needs to make when you're young. So you can have stunted bodies, but that doesn't mean that you weren't innately programmed to have kidneys that worked a particular way and a pancreas that works a particular way. You've just been redirected by the constraints of the environment. And the same can hold true for our societies. If you take a group of people and put them in an environment that's, let's say, has plentiful resources versus one that has scarce resources, you might find that the manifestations of the social suite are different. And one of the chapters of the book, I try to look for natural experiments of this. So I look at a whole variety of things, but one of the things I look is at shipwrecks. There were over 7,000 shipwrecks during the European period of exploration of the Earth between 1500 and 1900. And I found 20 examples of shipwrecks where at least 19 people had been isolated on their own with no contact with other humans for at least 2 months. And I try to treat this as a natural experiment where, a group of people had been suddenly thrown together and left to their druthers to make a kind of society. What kind of society did they make? And how did the kind of society they made, what role did it play in their ability to survive? Now, there are many problems with this natural experiment, but it's entertaining to look at these stories, and they certainly serve a rhetorical purpose, but they also provide some instruction. And there are many other better experiments that are discussed in the book. But anyway, so the point is that we, in order to make a function, we are predestined to make a society with these features. And when we make societies with these features, we thrive. We do better than when we lack those features.
Okay, so again,
and it takes tremendous cultural pressure to stop them. So if you look at totalitarian states, many totalitarian states see the family and the love that might exist between. So, for example, just to step back, another set of things I look at is not just unintentional societies like shipwrecks, but intentional societies like communes. And for thousands of years, we have records of people saying, society's screwed up. We don't like X, Y, or Z quality of society. Let's go out and make a new society. So a group of people will go into a mountain or woods or something and try to make a new society. They've been doing this since Roman times. And I think, by the way, we're about to have another, in the United States, every generation or two, we have a peak in communes, communitarian movements. I think we're about to have another one, actually, in the United States right now, historically speaking. But for these types of communal movements, sex and intimacy between couples is a threat, whether you have a charismatic leader or not. Because what they want is the members of the group to have a primary fealty to the group or to the leader, not to subcomponents of the group, like to their partner. So paradoxically, one of the solutions to this challenge can go to either extreme. You have groups like the Shakers which say, okay, no sex. You can't have sex with each other. We're going to take that off the table. So you're really going to just feel no special devotion to another person. You're just going to feel devotion to the group. Or they go to the other extreme and say, okay, anyone can have sex with anyone else. We're kind of a free, everyone's an available partner. So no special partner on that extreme either. But those you see are cultural forces that are being applied to stop this innate desire to have an intimate, loving relationship with a particular person, with one person, let's say. Or, again, leaving aside, which is discussed in the book, polygamy. Friendship is the same. You can have a situation like the Stasi in East Germany. The Stasi, I think it's been now ascertained that they had like 50% of the members of that society were informants. So in that society, you couldn't trust anybody. You couldn't whisper to your friend, the kind of conversation we all have with our close friends where we're reveal private thoughts and information. You couldn't say to your friend, my God, this government is really screwed up. Because the person you're speaking to might be a secret informant and rat you out and you would go to prison. So, it broke the application of the secret police was broke or cleaved or constrained this very natural tendency to have friendships, but only for so long, right? I mean, a tremendous cultural force was applied, and it only succeeded for so long before we went back to our innate desire to have friendships. Which, by the way, I mean, you can also make the argument that certain political rights, and I don't make this argument in the book because my book is not about historical forces, but I do argue that political arrangements and cultural attributes that try to suppress these natural proclivities are doomed to fail. And I mentioned the Stasi just now, and conversely, there are political arrangements that try to work with rather than against the social suite. So societies, for example, that preserve the freedom of association, or even the freedom of speech, can be seen as a kind of political arrangement that supports social learning, which is part of the social suite. Like, right, the flow of information that we live in networks in part so as to distribute useful information to each other. And we thrive when we can share information about how to build a fire, or where there are predators or prey, or how to make a particular tool. We are cultural animals. We evolved to be cultural animals, and that at its root, that is about the sharing of information across time and across space. It's to our advantage to do that. And arrangements that suppress that are not natural in a way. And therefore, you could make the argument that arrangements that constrain the freedom of expression are just like arrangements that suppress the freedom of association, or that try to suppress love, or all of these other qualities. They are fundamentally not in keeping with the social suite, and therefore I would argue unlikely to succeed, or unlikely to lead to a thriving society. But these are things I'm talking, I mean, I kind of allude to some of this and talk about it briefly, but that's not the main, the book is not a political project. It's not trying to say, here's a cookbook for how to build a good society. That's not what I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's dwelling for a moment on this picture of stunted societies. In a nutshell, the claim is that on an evolutionary basis, forms of society that deviate considerably from these universals would be inherently unstable or unfavorable. And it's interesting that, like you said, this isn't supposed to be a cookbook. It's interesting, or at least a major upshot, that a normative claim arises from the descriptive work here, which at least facially goes against that adage that you can't derive an ought from an is.
Well, here I make use of Philippa Foot, right? In the moral psychology of the late 20th century. And her famous essay, right? The one on, I'm blocking on the title right now, but the first sentence is a magnificent first sentence, which is, in moral philosophy, I think it is helpful to think about plants, she says. What a magnificent sentence for a short essay. And her argument is that, after the Second World War and the horrors of the Nazis, it really threw moral philosophy into a tizzy, because how could we understand that there's any kind of objective morality, or how could we explain the existence of such evil? This was a real problem for the moral philosophers. And so there was a lot of ferment. I'm sure you know this better than I do. I just sort of dipped into that literature. But there was a set of ideas about the philosophy of morality. And in that stream, Philippa Foot argues that you can make an argument that something is good when where do you find like a fundamental objective basis for making a moral claim? Like, how do you reach a kind of solid foundation to say, well, this is good and this is bad? Well, is it not all just arbitrary? Maybe we define the Nazis as bad, but from their perspective, they were good. Who are we to say what's right or wrong, right? So they're slipping around in this mess. And then they begin to try to look for, the moral philosophers try to look for, please correct me because you may know this much better than me, They try to find, well, what is a sound foundation? And Philippa Foot argues that we can say that something is good when it's in keeping with its nature. So, for example, the purpose of a clock is to tell time. Therefore, a good clock tells time correctly, and a bad clock does not. And with plants, the purpose of the roots is to nourish the plant. So we can say you have good roots or bad roots, you see? So this is her solution, which I kind of embrace, to say that we can say that a society, that these qualities are good insofar as they are crucial to having a functional society, right? In order for a society to be a society, it must have these qualities. Anyway, that's the sketch of the argument, which is towards the end of the book. I don't know whether you find it satisfying or not, or it still leaves you wanting.
So metaethics is, that's what the discipline would be called in philosophy, is a bit outside of my ken, but I'm, at least at this point, not a moral realist, so I don't believe that there are moral facts. I think these things are sort of constructed based on our intuitions, but there's nothing objective about them in the way that facts about physics might be objective.
Would you be willing to say that a predator has sharp teeth or dull teeth?
I think I would be willing to say that, at least.
And would you be willing to say that the sharp teeth are better for, you've observed that the sharp teeth are better for hunting prey than the dull teeth?
Yes.
Well, it's in that vein that I would say that love is better than hate.
I'm totally willing to admit that. Absolutely. So that's taking sort of a pragmatic attitude to things.
Yes, I would acknowledge that it's that the foundation that we're resting on is a kind of functionalist one, right? We come to say, well, let's stipulate that we need to tell time. Let's stipulate that clocks exist. Now, having made those stipulations, can we define a good clock and a bad clock? So yes, I acknowledge that there might be other predicates to where we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, one last question that I wanted to ask about the social suite while we're talking about these cultural universals and the extent to which cultural universals in general are controversial is whether any of the 8 are more controversial than others. Because, for instance, to just take the first one on the list, the capacity to have and recognize individual identity, it can't really be debated, or I don't see how it could be debated as, one, not evolutionarily ingrained, but also not necessary or important for human social flourishing. So are there any that don't meet these two criteria, obviously?
In terms, if by controversial you mean what is the evidentiary basis for the claims, I obviously don't think they are controversial in that sense. And that is, I think that the evidence of the centrality of those qualities is quite compelling. But there are a couple that are controversial in other senses. For example, mild hierarchy and in-group bias, which are 2 features of the social suite we haven't talked much about. There's a lot of controversy about how natural they are, how extensive they should or shouldn't be, whether they are positives or negatives. So, for example,
a Marxist
mild hierarchy. Yeah. We are not an egalitarian species. Even amongst hunter-gatherers, when you go and you look at inequality in hunter-gatherers, you find inequality there. For example, if you measure the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of economic inequality, it's a number that goes from 0 to 1. In 0, everyone has the same resources. At 1, one person has all the resources and everyone else has nothing. The United States right now has a Gini coefficient of 0.4. That's at a century-high peak. We're a very unequal society. Morocco has a Gini of 0.4. Scandinavian societies would have Gini's much lower, 0.25 or something like that. But if you go to hunter-gatherer societies, even there's economic inequality. It's been measured like 0.12, for example. So there's some de minimis inequality that is present in any society in terms of, a lot of it relates to genetic variation, right? Some people are born faster than others and stronger than others and smarter than others. And this natural lottery and talents can then give rise to a kind of inequality, let alone the social lottery, which is another thing. Some people are born, let's say, into richer families than others, even in hunter-gatherer societies. So the natural lottery endows us with different abilities. This gives rise to some de minimis inequality. And there have been studies looking at a fantastic study that I cite in the book, for example, so-called knockout studies where working with troops of primates, the experimenters can go in and remove the leader. And then what happens in that society when you remove the leader and you try to make it more equal, let's say? Well, chaos breaks out. You get a lot of fighting amongst the other primates as they're competing for who can be the top dog and so on. So there's a whole set of arguments that I discuss in the book about the benefits of mild hierarchy. But so on the one hand, we're not a completely unequal species, but we're also not a very overly hierarchical species. For example, we're not like walruses or certain kinds of deer species where, for instance, one animal dominates all the mating opportunities. One male will kill all the other males and then have access to all the females, let's say. So we have mild hierarchy, and there are advantages to mild hierarchy, it turns out. Advantages in terms of the flow of information, the suppression of violence, and so on. But not too much. If we get too much hierarchy, we band together and we kill the despot. And this draws on some work by Richard Wrangham and other primatologists who've looked at this topic. And I discuss all of that literature in the book. So we have a kind of mild hierarchy. We have a certain amount of hierarchy that is intrinsic to our species and that actually is advantageous in a number of ways, some of which I've alluded to. But there's controversy about this, right? There's controversy, well, how much is the right amount of hierarchy and how much is too much? And why do we have any? And maybe we don't have any. Maybe we shouldn't have any. Maybe we truly are egalitarian, which I think the evidence rejects that claim. The other one, which is a bit controversial, is this, it's depressing to me too, which is in-group bias. Why is it that everywhere in the world, people prefer the company of those they resemble? Resemble can be defined all kinds of ways. Have my same religion, eat the same food that I do, live in the same place that I live in, speak my language, whatever the hell it is. It's very arbitrary, which is another thing. We make arbitrary distinctions, but then we become very committed to them. For example, there's some famous experiments with little children, toddlers, that can be randomly assigned to yellow and green T-shirts. We can test, and the toddlers understand that it was random, that they didn't do anything to be given a yellow or a green T-shirt. And then as soon as we do this is called the minimal group paradigm. The toddlers given the yellow T-shirts really like the other yellow T-shirted toddlers. And the toddlers with green T-shirts, they're awful children. They should be punished. It's just an absurd. You can just scratch the surface and elicit from us this preference for our own group, even over a trivial thing like T-shirt color, even to tiny children. So everywhere in the world, we see this in-group bias. The question is why, and there's a very interesting set of ideas, I think likely true, that this in-group bias co-evolved with our capacity for cooperation. Let me give you a little toy model, and then I'll shut up, that explains this. Imagine you have 1,000 people, the population of 1,000 people, and you go to those 1,000 people and you tell them, be nice to each other. If you all work together, it'll be better for you than if you don't work together. If you cooperate with all these 1,000 people, you'll have a more thriving population, and you yourself will fare better than if you are selfish and don't cooperate with these 1,000 people. Well, even in telling this story, the listeners are probably thinking, darn, that's hard to cooperate with 1,000 people. I might be nice to someone and never see them again. Why would I be nice to them? There are 1,000 of us. I might never see them again. Or I can't track them. Like I was nice to you, but now I don't recognize you when I see you again because I can't track 1,000 people and know who 1,000 people are and so on. But now imagine that I come to this population of 1,000 and do something which is known as give it structure. I issue to these 1,000 people 10 flags of different colors, a green flag and a purple flag and a brown flag and so on. And now I form 10 groups of 100 and people are walking around holding these flags. And now I say to you, you know what, just be nice to the people that are holding your color flag. You should think you probably are feeling more relaxed. That's an easier job, right? I could just be nice to people holding the purple flag and I can ignore the others. I don't have to be mean to them. I don't have to send them to the ovens to burn them. I'll just be nice to the people with purple flags. And it turns out that when you do that, you get more cooperation. The amount of cooperation seen in the 1,000 people and in each individual on average is higher when you've added structure to the population by forming these groups and by encouraging people to just be nice to the in-group. You don't have to encourage them to hate the out-group. That's another wrinkle, which is interesting. Just be nice to your own group. So there are very deep and likely true arguments that our capacity to be nice to each other, to cooperate with each other, to act altruistically, co-evolved with our capacity to make arbitrary distinctions between us and them, and then to be nice just to us. The question is, why so often do we also hate them? Because there's no obvious reason we should hate them. Maybe just being nice to us is enough. And there's another set of ideas as to why we often come to hate them, although it's a little less clear. Anyway, in-group bias is another feature of human social order that is a bit more controversial.
Well, I'd like
Certainly it depresses me. Like, of the social suite, that's the one that's most depressing to me. Like, I find it, I almost didn't want to, I wanted to be dishonest and not include it because I didn't want to talk about it, because it depresses me that we are such a parochial species, that we like us and hate them. But I think it is a feature of social life. It's seen everywhere, in every group, in all times. It's not possible to suppress it. You can try, if you're a totalitarian state, to require everyone to wear the same attire. But it's very difficult to eliminate this.
Mm-hmm. Well, returning though for a moment to the mild hierarchy universal, much of this conversation we've been talking about how our genes play a role in the erection and then the subsequent structure of societies, but not so much how individuals' genes might put them into different positions in social networks.
That's right.
And is there much work done here? So I'm reading right now Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I talked to Paul Bloom recently as well. I'm not sure if this came up there.
You've been speaking to all my friends. Danny's a friend and Paul is a friend.
Yeah. And Steve, that's great. You have really good, really smart friends. But I mean, if somebody's got a square jaw, they're very likely to be, they're more, all other things being equal, they're more likely to be put into a higher place in an organization if they look a certain way, this sort of thing. But I'm wondering if there's much work that you've looked into relating to how people get placed into social networks based on their genes.
So I'm less interested in that.
I can imagine that that's very controversial, and you could, yeah.
Well, it's not so much that I'm shying away from controversy, but I'm my sort of characterologically, I'm a kind of optimistic person who thinks good of the world and likes to focus on good and happy things. And I spent a lot of my time earlier in my career studying death and end-of-life care. So it's not like I haven't studied sad things, but at the moment, I'm sort of interested in accentuating the positive or studying positive qualities that humans have. I'm also more interested in universals than in non-universals. And so, but it is the case, as you suggest, that people will be randomly assigned, as we talked about earlier, by the natural lottery. I mean, some people will be born with severe developmental delay, or some people will be born with anencephaly, no brain. They die within days of hours of birth. That's totally unjust and is a working of the natural lottery. People will be born with all kinds of advantages and disadvantages. And this is a fundamental fact of being an animal, which we are. In addition, there's a social lottery, and this has been appreciated by philosophers for thousands of years. Thomas Jefferson writes magnificently about the social lottery, and Aristotle does, Plato does. I mean, there and often. Well, anyway, that's another topic. But I think it's the workings of the social lottery that typically forms of government should try to stop. Right? Like we have a sense that both can be unjust, the natural lottery and the social lottery. But we have a sense that the social lottery is especially unjust, right? And that we might, for example, want to implement progressive taxation to undo the workings of the social lottery. We might also want to provide for public funds to have Braille signs everywhere so that people who are born blind because of the natural lottery, we as a society are going to try to redress the workings of the natural lottery. And so I do think about these things, and I certainly do talk about them in Blueprint, but I'm less interested in studying, the genetic determinants of schizophrenia or diabetes or developmental delay than I am in studying the genetic determinants of social order. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, you did. You totally did. Well, to end, what I wanted to ask is if there are any problems or maybe strong points in today's culture. Maybe we should restrict ourselves to the United States that you can identify because they're either in tension or copacetic with the 8 universals in the social suite that you've identified.
Well, I think, there's this, in the book, I talk about how B.F. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist at Harvard, who did all those famous experiments with pigeons, and he writes a novel called Walden 2, which becomes a bestseller unexpectedly. And some people buy this book, this novel about it's actually about a professor and his students, sort of odd, who set out to make a kind of society that was guided by the principles of behaviorism, which happened to be Skinner's expertise. So it's a novel about a communitarian movement, a commune, the establishment of a commune guided by behaviorism. The novel becomes a bestseller. Some people buy this novel and then actually use the novel to set up real societies. So there's some communitarian societies that are set up that I discuss in the book, one in Mexico, one in Virginia, that use this novel as a guide for how to organize their commune. And so I don't intend for Blueprint to be like that. I don't intend for the book to somehow be a guide for political arrangements, even though I think it's very relevant, I think, to how you have a healthy organization or a good company or a good society. I mean, the title of the book is The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society is the subtitle of the book. And of course, it has a very almost prescriptive title, right? Blueprint is a pretty powerful word. I'm not unaware of these things. So having said all of that, I'm wary of making political pronouncements, but I will say the following thing. One of the things about the social suite we haven't talked about is, you mentioned it, is individuality. And it's sort of almost a paradox that in order to be a social species, we have to have an individual identity. And in our species, we use our faces to do this. We We communicate our individuality through our faces. All of our kidneys to do their job should work the same and look the same. But for our faces to do their job, they should all look different. And actually having a different faces is an evolutionary luxury. I mean, ask yourself, why don't we all have the same face? I mean, we don't. And the capacity to have different faces is an evolutionary luxury. Not only that, but you can recognize different faces. And this takes a huge part of your brain is allocated to facial recognition, to saying that this person is not that person. So the ability to communicate individuality and to detect it is an evolutionary luxury, and it is required for social life, because if you want to be able to signal this, I am your offspring, feed me, or you've had sex with me, not someone else, or you owe me something, not someone else. I was nice to you, not someone else. You should repay the favor. You need some way of signaling this is me and the other person to be able to detect it. So individual identity is a crucial part of the social suite. By the way, if you lived on your own, you wouldn't need to do that, right? Like, again, the irony is that our capacity to communicate our individuality requires someone else. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother. There's no one else to perceive it. Why would we have an individual identity? So when you look at our current political problems in our society, they come from this kind of tribalism. Earlier, picking up the example, we have 1,000 people that are divided into, 10 groups of 100 people, and they're fighting with each other, these divisions. And there are basically two ways to address that conflict, both of which have political predicates in our society. One way is to recognize that these divisions are arbitrary and to go up a level to the group of the population, to say we are all Americans. And this is like the science fiction trope, when the aliens invade, all of the previous divisions between countries and within countries are thrown out because we all are united against a common enemy. We're all human beings. And you have this kind of sensibility that we are all together. And so one way to address the divisions in our society is to go up a level and say, look, we are all Americans. And in fact, this is something that has been appreciated as a feature of our society for hundreds of years. De Tocqueville writes about this, writes about this sensibility that anyone can be an American. We're a nation of immigrants. You just come to this country and you buy into certain principles and you're an American. Other societies, by the way, aren't organized this way. It's very difficult to become Japanese or become Swiss, politically. But anyone can in principle, become an American. So that's one solution to our problem, is to go up a level. But the other solution to our problem is to go down a level. One of the solutions to the tribalism that's so ascendant right now, that says, well, you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're black or you're white, or you're Christian or you're Muslim, or all of these divisions in our society, is to go down a level and to recognize that we're all, first of all, unique individuals, and that our membership in these groups is arbitrary and maybe not so important. And this is actually Martin Luther King's solution, right? Martin Luther King says, I look forward to the time when my children will be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That we see each other as unique individuals, not as mere members of the purple flagged or the green flagged group. So these solutions to our current tribalism, which is causing us so much problems, are solutions that exist in us already. We have access to those solutions. We can go up a level and see ourselves as part of a greater whole, or we can go down a level and see each other as unique individuals worthy of respect and cherishing.
Well, Nicholas, this was, totally terrific. And that was also a great note to end on. I've really wanted to talk about anthropology and evolutionary biology on the show for a very long time. And this was so worth the wait. Thank you so much for your time and your work, of course, too.
Thank you so much for having me, Robinson. It was a pleasure.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please like, subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Earhart, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Earhart on Robinson Eats, please do so.